dating this young lady that I meet in college. The relationship became sexual very quickly. And very soon afterwards, she comes to me with news that I wasn't ready to hear, that she was pregnant. It was weeks later before she had the abortion. So the morning of it, she calls me and she asked me the same question she's been asking me for weeks. David, do you think this is the right thing to do? I did say, yes, I think it's the right thing to do. And later on, afterwards, we talk on the phone, and I can't even understand what she's saying. She has been traumatized by what she has gone through. She is crying. And I knew, even though I wasn't a follower of God, I knew the decision that I made was actually choosing my life, my dreams, my plans above this baby. I knew it wasn't a blob of tissue. So that immediately brought a lot of guilt and a lot of shame. I would go into depression, very deep depression, and not know when I'm going to come out of it. And I realized it's because of my selfishness and my sin. That day in the midst of my apartment, all alone, I felt like the presence of God met me. And for the first time in my life, I bowed my knees before God. I asked Jesus Christ to forgive me for my sin. I rose up with a peace that I had never known in my life before. At this point, I'm thinking I'm a man whose life has changed. You know, I'm Christian and I have a wife who is a Christian, and so things should be different and be better. But there's some other things that I'm realizing that are still in my life. There's this tremendous anger, and it was affecting us. It was affecting our marriage. It was affecting my relationship with our kids. About 15 years since I've been walking with Christ, I ended up taking a position to be a chaplain of an NFL team. And in the process of that, I have a conversation with this guy. I never shied away from any parts of my story. He goes, David, how have you allowed Jesus to heal you from the wound of abortion in your heart? I said, I've never specifically asked Jesus to heal me of that wound. So he goes, can I do two things? Can I send you a book? And then the second thing is, can I set you up with a male peer counselor to go through an abortion recovery Bible study? And I said yes to both of those things. And God began to minister to some of those areas of anger and depression and to begin to lift those. And he's transforming me and making me a better husband and a better father. But it was years along the way. And it took really another man to point out to me that there might be a connection between what you experienced with that abortion and some of the pain and the hurt that you're experiencing in your life. So I would say, don't hear this and walk away. If you don't do anything, this will continue to affect areas of your life. But if you allow the light of Christ to shine into that dark place, he can begin to bring healing, a healing that will not only be for you, but it could affect your relationship with your wives if you're married, with your children. You know, God cares about the preborn baby, and he hates the shedding of innocent blood. But God's heart is for more than that. God's heart is for the mom and the dad to have an encounter with the author of life so that their lives are radically transformed by the grace of God.
Good morning. I stand before you today solely because of the grace of Jesus Christ. When I think of the horrible act that I was complicit in the death, the murder of my firstborn child, the only reason that I have to stand before you is because of God's amazing grace, a grace that is greater than our sin. And the greatest gift in my life is to know the Creator, Jesus Christ, to know his redemption, his redeeming love. It has meant everything in my life. And so I am grateful to be here today. Georgette, thank you for the invitation to speak. Thank you, Anglicans for Life, for what you do. And I'm excited about what God is doing as he is ministering to people to take a stand for the life of the preborn, but to minister to those who have been broken by abortion as well. I want to show you all a tangible picture of, and you saw it, a tangible picture of God's mercy and grace to me as my family. My wife of 20 years, Taria, and our 6 kids. We never have a quiet moment around our house. And God is using our children in many ways to grow me up. He's placed me there to help them to grow in him, but he is using them to grow me and mature me in him. I also have an older son, my son Sakari. There's parts of my story the video didn't hit, so I'm gonna hit some of that. But I have an older son from a first marriage, my son Sakari, who is 27 years of age, who lives in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And the very fact that he is there, and to think of what I lost in the death of my first child, and to see the relationship I have with my son, though there are some hard things in it, it breaks my heart that I don't have a 30-year-old daughter that I could be walking with, pouring into, having conversations, laughing with, sensing her heart for me. It breaks my heart, but God has had a work of mercy in me and my son Sakari's relationship, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. I had the privilege of serving Jesus in ministry for the past 23 years, and that's looked different over the years. I started in youth ministry, did college ministry with Campus Crusade for Christ. I was an NFL chaplain to the Cincinnati Bengals for a season, which I thought was the ultimate men's ministry. I have been a senior pastor at a church, and for the last 9 years, I have been an evangelist and a pro-life advocate, ministering to men, starting out as an advocate at a pregnancy resource center in Orlando, ministering to men who found themselves in the crisis due to an unplanned pregnancy, and men who had been broken by abortion. And for the past few years, being a part of an organization called MAN, which is Men and Abortion Network, and also serving as a volunteer staff member with Save One as a men's chapter leader, but also a speaker with Save One. And for those of you who do not know Save One is an abortion recovery ministry, an international ministry where our whole mission is to help men, women, and families to recover from abortion. So as you all look at me today, what you're looking at is a man who knows the guilt, the shame, the loss, the pain of abortion. And yet you're looking at a man who knows the forgiveness, the healing, the grace, and the restoration of Jesus Christ for the wound of abortion. I want to share with you a little more of my story to give you a little more context, and then I want to share with you why it's important that we not forget the man when we think of this issue of life and when we think of abortion. So that video was really short, and it's 31 years of a story that's being told that they put together in 4 minutes, so lots of things are lost in it. But after the abortion, there were lots of symptoms that overtook my life, and at first I never correlated them to the abortion. But the young lady that I was with who had the abortion was my first girlfriend, first person I'd ever had sex with, and I could justify that I was in a sexual relationship with her because we loved each other. But after the abortion, I became very promiscuous, and I began using women in some regards to medicate my pain. I drank alcohol before the abortion, but afterwards it wasn't drinking alcohol to have fun or to be the life of the party. Drinking alcohol was a way for me to drown my sorrows. Anger and rage overtook my life. I was depressed quite often and didn't know when I would go into it and when I would come out of it. It was these deep, deep valleys that I was in because of the fact that I justified the reason for the abortion being me getting a college education, and the child would get in the way of that. I had this unhealthy drive to finish my college education, and it was almost like I'm going to succeed in this because I had a massive fail in protecting life, which instinctively as a man, I think God puts in us. And I had a very hard time making decisions. And that was kind of how my life was going. Because of the fact that I lived this way, I found myself through being promiscuous with women. I found myself 3 years later in a place where another young lady comes to me and she says she's pregnant. And I remember the guilt and the pain and the loss that happened. And I in some regards, didn't want to go through that again. The young lady said to me that I don't know if I can be a mom on my own. When she said that, because of my experience, this is how I heard it, that if I'm not going to be with her, she's going to have an abortion. She never said that, but that's how I processed it. So what I did is I decided I'll be with you. I will marry you. We're going to have this child because I don't want to go through the pain I went through before. And it wasn't because I was all of a sudden pro-family or pro-life. In many regards, I was trying to atone for the sin that I had committed in the past. Well, I put a ring on her finger, and it didn't change anything about me. It didn't change my heart. And so now I'm committing adultery on my wife. I'm angry. The anger is even escalated because I feel like I'm trapped in a marriage that I really didn't want to be in, and that anger is spilling out on my wife. I'm depressed. We have a son, which should be the most joyous day in my life. Past the balloons, past the cigars, but that wasn't the case. Instead, my heart felt so numb at this great gift of a life being born into the world. I dove myself into my career. I dove myself into going back to graduate school. It was almost like I'm going to do something to make a success in this world. But after 4 years of going through and living like that, my wife and I divorced. And it was through that where God used some men in my life to minister to me Christ, that God opened my eyes to the reality of God's love for me, the reality of his forgiveness for me. And it was that drove me to my knees, crying out to my Creator for mercy, and Jesus Christ saving my soul and beginning to do a transformative work in me. God began to cut out things in my life, set me free from things that I had been bound in, set me free from sexual immorality. From the day that I bowed my knee to Jesus Christ to this very day, the only woman that I have had sex with is my wife, Taria, and we did not have sex until we said, I do, 4 years later. God began to break me free from unhealthy relationships. He set me free from drunkenness and alcohol. And then as he was preparing me to walk in a faithful relationship with him, by the blessing of God, blessed me with a wonderful, godly wife. But as I got into this marriage, I realized there were some things in me that were still there. I was still very, very angry, and sadly, that anger has hurt my wife through words, and even early in our marriage with my hands, I've hurt my wife. We were having kids, and my heart was still numb. All those beautiful kids you saw, my heart's still numb. Can't realize, why can't I bond with my kids? My wife and I'd have big decisions to make, and I'd be indecisive and didn't feel like I could make them. I'm in ministry, and I'm serving the purposes of God, but yet ministry is more about me than about Jesus Christ, who I may proclaim with my lips. But ministry for me was my way to get the attaboys that I never got and the applause from men, and it was for the wrong motivation and the wrong purpose, and that was what my life looked like. And then I was asked to speak at a pregnancy resource center. And speaking there was a man there that some of you may know. He's I would say a giant today in the pro-life movement, a guy named Brad Mattis. He is with Life Issues Institute. Brad Mattis happened to be there that day, heard me share that day, and came to me with what I thought was a crazy question. And he says to me, David, how have you invited Jesus to heal the wound of abortion? By this time, the abortion had been 22 years prior. I had been walking with the Lord for 16 years. I honestly thought the question was a little crazy, because I thought in my mind, Jesus has healed me. Of course there's been healing. But I didn't say that to Brad. What I said to Brad is I never have invited Jesus to heal that wound. So he said, I'm going to send you a book, which he did, which helped me to connect the dots between some of the things I was experiencing and that abortion that was 20-something years ago at the time. And then he connected me with a male peer counselor. And through that, as I walked through an abortion recovery Bible study, God brought levels of healing to me I didn't even know that I needed. God, I didn't realize how, though I recognized that God had forgiven me of everything, I still felt that there was something I needed to pay because of what I had done. And what that was doing was really telling God that the cross of Jesus Christ and his death on the cross for me wasn't sufficient. And I had to realize and recognize that his death was totally sufficient for everything I've done, and it's his blood that covers my sin, and there is no other sacrifice needed other than the one he gave for me, and that began to free my heart. God began to lift the anger and lift the depression, which has blessed my marriage and my relationship with my kids in ways that I would have never imagined. And 10 years ago, my mom died suddenly, and I had a very hard time grieving my mom's loss. And I was wondering, why is that? Well, there probably were a couple reasons. When my girlfriend and I told our parents that there was a pregnancy, and we asked our moms what we should do, our mothers kind of co-signed on what I had told my girlfriend the way we should go. So there was some unforgiveness in my heart towards my mom. I had to release that to the Lord and forgive her as Christ had forgiven me. But also it was hard for me to grieve her loss because there was another significant loss in my life that society told me I never had to grieve. They told me it wasn't even a life at all, that I could do it and just move on and life would go on as usual. But the life of my daughter Miriam, her life was created in the image of God, had intrinsic worth, dignity, and value because of being created by God. And I, for years, just walked past that and kept on going. But going through this allowed me to grieve that loss, but to also realize that the daughter that I wasn't a hero and a provider and a protector for, that she's not in heaven mad at me. She's in the presence of perfect love. She is enveloped by the love of God. And this one who I discarded, sacrificed on the altar of my future, that maybe she's looking down and looking at me as her hero. And one day, when I'm with Jesus and with her together, there's not going to be the conversation of, Dad, why did you abandon me? There's going to be great rejoicing in the presence of perfect love because of the redeeming love of Jesus Christ. That has changed everything in my life. So I stand before you today representing men who are often forgotten when there's an unplanned pregnancy, men who are often forgotten when there's an abortion decision that is made. And I want to talk to you about why men are important and the intentionality we need to have in ministering to the man, in addition to the preborn baby, the infant, as Alan Parker said, and in addition to the woman. And I believe that if we have an intentionality in that, it's going to give us a greater key to turning back the scourge of abortion in our nation. I had a friend years ago who was a music minister, and he went to minister at the church, and there was this stench that they couldn't find, and they went all around the church, and it was so bad they couldn't even rehearse that night. And so they ended up leaving the church, and when they left the church and closed the doors, he saw steam rising from the street, and he realized where the stench was coming from. It not only brought stench into the church, but it was affecting the whole street. There was a manhole cover that was out of place, and because the manhole cover was out of place, there was this stench that was coming from underneath the surface that was causing the whole block to stink. As he looked at that, he said he felt like the Holy Spirit say to him that that's what's wrong with our world today, that men are out of place. And because men are out of place, it's causing the stench of sin in our world to even be exemplified even greater. We know that sin is going to be a part of our world until Jesus Christ comes back and returns and he does away with it and he makes a brand new world. Sin is going to be a part of it. But when society is out of order, the way that God established it, with a man being the head of a family, not to lord over, but to serve, when the man is not in his place, it causes the stench of sin to be even greater in our world. And in order for us to mitigate the stench of sin, we have to be proactive in ministering to men. 63 million babies killed in their mother's womb, and rarely is there an outcry or there any media attention given to it. A woman attached to every one of those children and the trauma and the pain that she goes through physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. But we got to remember there's a man attached to every one of that. Janet Morano, in her book, Shockwaves of Abortion, she says the baby is at the epicenter of this destruction, but the mom and dad and society at large are feeling the shockwaves, the ripple effects that are shaking the very foundation of our nation. We live in a world, y'all. We live in a world where the narrative when it comes to abortion, y'all know it, it's either a political notion, and there is a part that politics plays, and Alan talked to us about that. But the other notion of it is painting it is a women's issue. It's a woman's right to choose. It's a woman's reproductive issue. And the way that it's been framed by our culture, what it does is it dehumanizes the other life that God is knitting together in the woman's womb. And it's given us, every excuse to murder those children for any and every kind of reason, because we've dehumanized them being created in the image of God from the moment of fertilization. But what it also has done is caused us to be uncaring to the woman, where they put it up as woman empowerment. It's not woman empowerment. It is being uncaring and leading a woman to something that leads to death, a sin that leads to death. And we know that nothing good ever comes out of sin. So it's uncaring for the woman, and it's not just an easy decision. It's going to be a ripple effect that affects her and her family for the rest of her life. But we've minimized the man. We have completely minimized the man. Do we realize that a woman does not show up pregnant without a man? that man has a very important part in the procreation process. He is the one who gives the sperm that fertilizes that egg, and so that man is a father of a preborn child. But we've allowed men to shirk their responsibility because we don't frame it this way. We allow men to shirk their God-given responsibility, and in doing so, you know what we've done? We've put an undue and a heavy burden on women that they were never called to carry alone. Because of the climate that is there, some men repress their emotions, they repress their feelings when there is an unplanned pregnancy, and they say nothing to their partner because in doing so they think they're being supportive. And then there are other men like me, because it's been said that we really don't have a responsibility. We can tell the young lady that she should have an abortion and really in that moment not feel any moral dilemma with it because we're not even included to be a part of the process. And though our society may deem that man really has no place and he's not all that significant, well, research and the stories of men that I work with and my own story gives a very, very different picture. Research that's been done by women on women that have had abortions will say the number one person they talk to about the abortion is the man. And the number one person who has influence on what they do in the abortion is the man. Lifeway Research has just put out a research project they did. 1,000 men were surveyed that CareNet paid for Lifeway to do. And in that, men themselves say that they are the number one influence as to why their partner has an abortion. Society may say man doesn't have a voice, but the man does have a voice and he has influence. And oftentimes that influence isn't used the right way. And it causes the manhole cover to be out of place. Its influence awry, and the stench of sin from this horror of abortion continues to contaminate our world. But we as the pro-life community, we have to engage this narrative differently. In some regards, we've kind of bought it a little bit. You know, we realize that there's a baby there, so we don't buy it in that sense. We know that it's bigger than just the woman. We realize there's another life that's there. It's not just a woman's issue because there's a baby there. So we minister to the baby. We speak up for the baby, which we should, because we're to be a voice for the voiceless. We're to defend the weak. We're to rescue the innocent. That is what God has called for us to do. And we minister to the women, but we've forgotten about the man. We've forgotten about the man, and we have to minister to all three. I saw some signs yesterday, and I get the sentiment of them, love them both. But there's another one that God calls us to love as well. We got to minister to that baby. We got to minister to the woman. But there's a man who needs ministry as well. Because the man hasn't been validated as a father, when an abortion decision happens, it's not surprising that most people don't even think about the man. We recognize the woman, we recognize the trauma it brings her, but because we haven't validated the man on the front end, we don't think about the man on the back end. But I want you to realize that a man who is the father of a preborn child that has been aborted, he has tremendous loss in his life. He has the loss of fatherhood. And there is something deep that breaks inside the heart and the soul of a man when there is an abortion decision. The man is a father. There's something deep that breaks in him, and abortion hurts men. We got to recognize that abortion hurts men as well. Brad Mattis, the guy I shared with you, who enlightened me to the fact that abortion was affecting me in deep ways, he says there's 5 ways that God has put an instinct in men. And there's the 5 P's. There's the P's of procreation. Men are to provide, to protect, to perform, and to have pleasure. Think about when an abortion happens. That procreation process that the man was a part of, a very important part of, when an abortion happens, that procreation process fails. It comes to nothing. It ends tragically in the death of his child. Because of the abortion, the instinct to provide and protect, he doesn't get to do that, and it breaks something deep inside a man. That performance he had of sexual intimacy with a woman, which at one time may have been pleasurable, now brings a tremendous amount of pain to that man's life. There is a tremendous breaking in a man's soul when there's an abortion decision that is made. There's also been considerable anecdotal research on the effects of abortion on men. And some of the effects of the loss of fatherhood due to abortion include things such as anger, depression, substance abuse, the loss of and failed future relationships, the inability to trust women, promiscuity, the inability to forgive, sexual dysfunction, poor bonding with children, nightmares, and the inability to make decisions. Men are impacted by abortion. But you know what often happens with men? Because we've been so disconnected from the issue, for a lot of men, it's hard for them to connect the dots. They may be walking through the pain and the trauma of something that happened in their life 20, 30, 40 years ago, and oftentimes it's hard for them to even connect it with an abortion that they may have been involved in, unless somebody would bring that to their attention, as Brad brought it to my attention. And yet there are other men who realize they're hurting. They realize that the experience is tied to the abortion decision, but they don't feel like they have a right to hurt because it was because of their influence that that child isn't here today. And then there's other men who are bitter because they didn't have a say in the matter. So just like women need to invite Jesus into that wound of abortion, so do men who have been a part of an abortion decision. They need to invite Christ to heal them from the shame, the guilt, and the pain of that abortion. And maybe you're sitting here today, or maybe you're watching virtually, and you're a man who has experienced pain of abortion. I want you to know there's healing and there's hope. And I'm going to put up a resource slide in just a few minutes. But the last part, just to give you a vision, just for a couple of minutes. You know what happens when people who have been deeply impacted by abortion receive the healing of Christ for those wounds? We see it all the time. We see masses of women that are rising up, and they're calling out, and they're refuting the lie of the enemy, and they're standing up for the truth, and they're standing up for life, and they're admonishing other women not to go this way because it's a road of death that leads to pain. And they're champions to bring healing to other women and to counsel them in the midst of their pregnancies. And this is what God wants to do with men, because men are a vital part and a key to abortion ending in our country. You know, we want to help these men to see, men who find themselves in the midst of a crisis due to an unplanned pregnancy. We want to help them to see their important role as fathers. And what I believe in the work that God has called me to do in ministering healing and hope to men that have been broken by abortion, that God so restores us and God so gives us a heart for other men that we can come alongside of other men and we can help them to realize the preciousness of the life of the child that God is knitting in their partner's womb. But we can also help these men to recognize the preciousness of their own life, that they are not just some deadbeat, that they are not just someone without a purpose, that they are created in the image of God, and no matter what life choices they have made, that God sent his sinless son into the world to forgive them of their sin and to reconcile them to God so that they could have a relationship with their heavenly Father. And then we're called to come alongside of these men to help them to understand what it means to be a man, what it means to be a father, what it means to honor God with sex the way he created it, what it means to be a husband, what it means to be God's warrior in the fight for life and God's warrior for his family. That's the call that God has given us. So what we long to see, and I know what you all long to see. You know what? If we don't minister to the man, I want to let you know, if we don't make the man a priority, here's what we're in for. You know, the law may change, and I'm praying that it does, because it's a grave injustice and a grave inhumanity to man. But the law changing, just like me putting a wedding ring on my fiance's heart and getting married, it didn't change my heart. There's only one thing that changes the human heart, And the only institution who has that isn't the White House, the courthouse, the Congress. It's the Church of Jesus Christ. It's the gospel of Jesus Christ. That changes hearts and changes lives. And if we're not ministering to men and we're just focused on ministering to women, well, we're still going to have unplanned pregnancies that are happening. We're still going to have women who are vulnerable to abortion from these unplanned pregnancies. We're going to have women that we counsel and who choose life but then find themselves in another unplanned pregnancy. We're going to have children growing up in homes where there's not two parents that are there, where there's a greater likelihood of neglect and abuse and poverty, where there's a greater likelihood of generational sins continuing. But what God wants to do is to minister to the man, so that the men are not impregnating these women, because we're honoring God and we're living for him. That the men and women in the face of crisis are having an encounter with Jesus Christ, the author of life, who transforms their life to help them to see the value of their life and the value of their child. For women to take up the mantle of motherhood, for men to take up the mantle of fatherhood, for men to lead in raising their children up in the fear and in the admonition of the Lord, so that God can break generational curses and sins off of families, and he can start a new generational blessing under the covenants of Jesus Christ. And if that sounds crazy to you, well, that's the story of what God is doing in my life. And I believe it's the story of what God wants to do in our world as we remember the man is important. Here are some resources, and I'm going to get out of the way. DavidWilliamsSpeaks.com is my website. There's a tab, Men and Abortion, where there's a lot of resources for that. menandabortion.net is another place where you can learn more about men and the effects of abortion on men. And SaveOne.org, who I work with, is a ministry, like I said, that provides healing. And if you're a man who needs healing from abortion, you can contact us at SaveOne.org. May God bless America. May God have mercy on us. May God pour his spirit out on us and return us to him, that we value life from the very inception in the womb to the end of natural life. Bless you.